All right, how is everyone doing? Welcome to my channel. And this channel focuses on great theories of everything, ancient and modern, things that you can use to, transform your life in terms of making a paradigm shift, awakening to 5D consciousness, forming a holistic worldview, tuning into better spiritual, mental, and physical health. And we try to turn you on to obscure sources that kind of give you a grand unified theory or a theory of everything, a cosmology that you probably aren't aware of. And today is our 14th day of doing the book called It's After the End of the World. Don't you know that yet? And this is on two relatively obscure groups of jazz musicians who did their thing in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s. Excuse me. We are in chapter 3, which happens to be mostly about New York. Some of the musicians moved to New York, Sun Ra Orchestra. And so we'll be going back to Chicago here at the end of the chapter. But right now we're talking about the Sun Ra Orchestra in New York, where the movement was the new thing, or the free jazz movement, or whatever you call it. It's a little bit different than it was in Chicago. And we'll see where we go here. So we're in toward the end of chapter 3. The fact that the orchestra was beyond the pale of the New York establishment is the primary reason Sun Ra was situated within the jazz-free movement. He was quick to distinguish himself from them. Quote, they were doing their thing, but they were not talking about space or intergalactic things. They were talking about avant-garde and the new thing. That was what was happening when I came to New York. But what I was doing also entered into the picture as a remote but indirect influence. End quote. Similarly, Sun Ra claimed his sound had nothing to do with the new thing. Quote, what I do is based on the natural, while what they do is probably based on what they learned in school. Their composers write the melody and leave it to the rhythm section to put their own rhythm to the melody. That's not the way I work. For me, the note is in my mind at the same time as the rhythm. The musicians don't know how to connect with the people. They play music and are very good at that. But what they're doing has nothing to do with the people. They have no sense of humor. They look at things from their own ego and through their talent. There's humor in all my music. It always has rhythm. No matter how far out it may be, you can always dance to it. End quote. Finally, in early 1962, after about 1 year in New York, the whole band found work at the Cafe Bazaar, a coffee house. Sun Ra made $5 per night and his sidemen $2 each, plus free meals. While the group often played to an empty house, sometimes a crowd would come in, and the bazaar fairly quickly became a hangout place for other black musicians, which eventually gave Sun Ra a base for recruiting. The band continued there for almost a year. Before long, the orchestra settled in a house in the East Village at 48 East 3rd Street. The move came just before life began to thrive there, just before what Schwed calls the second Harlem Renaissance, even though it was not in Harlem, in a milieu he contends was, quote, the closest America was able to get to integration at the time. Most of the musicians in the jazz-free movement lived in this area too. Sun Ra and his band claimed that it was more than a coincidence that the neighbors began to flower when he moved in. Gilmore remembered that Sun Ra had a charismatic effect on village ambiance. Quote, people started changing, wearing a different kind of clothes, coming up with a lot of creative, different types of styles. The afro and all that came out right after Sun Ra came to the village, said Gilmore. Generally, Sun Ra had his greatest effect on musicians. The Sun Palace, as it was called, quickly became a haven for musicians sitting in for big band rehearsal and listening to Sun Ra's lecturing. Sun Ra sounded almost like a military band leader when he commented on his recruiting. Quote, I look for the incorrigibles. If they don't fit in with somebody else, they're going to come back to me. That way I don't have to worry about keeping a band together. This tactic brought some tension, however, because Sun Ra would recruit members into his band who were not accomplished musicians. Sun Ra was more interested in their spirit, but some orchestra musicians alleged that it caused him to compromise his music. One remembered hearing, quote, inferior musicians that couldn't play. All they could do was get up and just play all these weird sounds, and it seemed he liked that. He only had maybe 3 or 4 people in the band that could play the arrangements. End quote. This musician's criticism was not the kind of logic Sun Ra would listen to, however. In fact, one time, that same musician criticized Albert Ayler's music, and he was chastised by Sun Ra. Quote, if you really don't know what somebody's doing, don't talk about it until you find out. What you don't understand, don't deface it. End quote. Sun Ra's hidden influence on the jazz-free movement was even more fundamental, at least according to him. Ra claimed that he was the singular influence on John Coltrane, the patron saint of the movement. Ra, in fact, regrets the influence because back in 1959 in Chicago, he gave Coltrane, quote, forbidden literature, and also, quote, some music that really put him on top through spiritual wisdom and direction, but he didn't develop, end quote. The guidance Sun Ra lent inspired Coltrane to search, but Ra says he never found it because he was trapped by his own dependence on jazz. Quote, the last time I saw Coltrane, Ra said, he told me he had run out of ideas. I told him, that's dangerous. It was too late. Also, Sun Ra was at least for a few years a silent partner to Leroy Jones. Jones admitted, quote, even though we were entering a deep nationalist phase, Sun Ra understood it in terms of his ideas of angels and demons at play. That is, if being good means being in tune with this planet that was no good, so he insisted on being a demon. Sun Ra had a larger agenda. In addition, Ra turned Jones onto dozens of books about Afrocentricity and other Kabbalistic matters that shaped his worldview. Jones, however, was not convinced enough to give up his political agenda. In Shwed's view, Jones also influenced Ra, particularly in terms of the avant-garde nature of his music. Shwed additionally argues that Sun Ra became tinged with a shade of militance as a result of his work with Jones. Once Malcolm X was killed in 1965, Jones changed his name, moved back to Harlem, and set up the Black Arts Center there. Sun Ra worked heavily with Baraka Jones's Black Arts organization. By this time, Ra had distanced himself from the jazz-free movement, but he still walked up to Harlem on most days to speak and hold forth at the Black Arts Center, which was naturally a fountainhead for Afrocentric ideas. Sun Ra's original contributions to Jazz Free were also pronounced in the area of recording and documentation. In 1961, orchestra saxophonist Pat Patrick got a day job at the Choreographer's Workshop, a practice space for dancers in Midtown, and eventually he convinced management to let Sun Ra rehearse and record there nights and weekends. Sun Ra also developed a trusting relationship with Fred Vargas and Warren Smith at Variety Studios. During the early and mid-1960s, while the rest of the jazz-free movement was hard-pressed to make any records at all, Sun Ra recorded perhaps a dozen, perhaps more, for his own label, Saturn. These albums had a small distribution, but Sun Ra knew the importance of documentation because it might be years before people got the orchestra's music. Sun Ra saw a mission to get the music documented and developed patience for the music's reception. When discussing the band's work at the Playhouse, where they worked starting in 1962, he commented that, quote, "They quite often play to an empty house, but I felt that it should always be doing what I was supposed to do on this planet, regardless of whether the planet responded. A spiritual duty. We stayed at the Playhouse for nearly a year." Sun Ra's recording techniques became extremely influential. As Schwed posited, quote, "By the 1950s, commercial recording companies had developed a classical style of recording which assured that the recording process itself would be invisible, the machinery of recording being used like a picture window through which an illusion was created of being there." But Sun Ra began to regularly violate this convention on the Saturn releases by recording live at strange sites, by using feedback, distortion, high delay or reverb, unusual microphone placement, abrupt fades or edits, and any number of other effects or noises which called attention to the recording process. On many Saturn LPs, the recording is actually interrupted by a phone call. Sun Ra's recording projects were aided by Vargas and Smith, but especially by drummer Tommy Hunter, who had moved to New York on his 21st birthday almost 15 years earlier after being put on a plane by Sun Ra to save Hunter's life from a particularly seedy incident in a mob-controlled striptease club in Calumet City, Illinois. Hunter worked closely with Ra to probe the nuances of the recording process. They began to record rehearsals and to become heavily involved in editing and sound effects. Ra also extended Jazz Free with his innovations in electronic music. He had stayed abreast of all the advances since the 1930s, but in the 1960s, new innovations multiplied, and Sun Ra was quick to try them. His use of electronic keyboards, especially the Moog synthesizer, were pioneering in the movement. Initially, many musicians were opposed to the idea of electronic music, but for Sun Ra, the crux of the matter was the instrument's, quote, "capacity for projection of feeling." In 1967, Sun Ra clarified his commitment to technology with the formation of Infinity Inc., which he originally incorporated as a humanitarian profit-making venture. In 1972, the state of Illinois changed it to a nonprofit. Infinity's original charter stated that its purpose was, quote, "to perform works of a humanitarian nature among all people of earth, to help stamp out and destroy ignorance, destroying its own major purpose, to changing ignorance to constructive life, creativity, to own and operate all kinds of research laboratories, studios, electronic equipment, electrochemical communicational devices of our own design and creativity, and electromechanical equipment, electronic equipment relating to audio and video devices, and audio and video devices themselves, including sound recordings and tapes, as well as video recordings, tapes, teleportation, astral projection devices, mind-cleansing sound devices, magnetic computers, electric and electronic devices related to all phases of interplanetary space travel. Still, Sun Ra related his modern technology to concepts dating back to ancient Egypt. Quote, the intergalactic music is in hieroglyphic sound, an abstract analysis and synthesis of man's relationship to the universe, visible and invisible. The people are the instrument. That's the intergalactic principle. Music has its place in history as an inspiration for survival. In New York, Sun Ra was also influential when it came to the subject of naming. He changed his own name in 1952, but during the 1960s, he convinced several of his band members to change their names to properly reflect something cosmic, something African, or something merely idiosyncratic. For example, Arkansas saxophonist Pharoah Sanders took on Pharaoh Sanders, while singer Art Jenkins began to write his name Art Jenkins, A-H-R-T, Jenkins, J-N-K-I-N-S, as James Jackson became James Jackson without a K. More radical, Doug Williams became Akhtal Iba, while Leroy Taylor became Elo Omo. Ra believed that a new name, a new vibration, was an important element for transformation. Starting in 1966, the band got a gig that finally got them recognition. Close to the Sun Palace, a new club called Slugs opened, and the orchestra began to work there every Monday, which was traditionally the professional musicians' night off. Shred describes the atmosphere. Quote, it was a long, dark room with bare brick walls and antique iron window grates, and with nylon parachutes draped from the ceiling. Slugs' location was enough to guarantee its furtive exclusiveness, being nowhere near a subway line and well off the cab track in an area largely unknown to tourists and those uptown. Getting there meant walking east from the Bowery or past the projects and the bombed out zone and past the Hells Angels of New York City headquarters. The location, along with the presence of drug dealers, guaranteed that Slugs would become primarily a musician's hangout. The clientele was heavily black and heavily male, reflecting this demographic. The music from the band, often swelling to 25 or 30 pieces, was a revelation to many witnesses. In a May 1967 issue of Downbeat, Michael Zwerin described the nature of the music. Quote, they swung harder and harder until quibbles about things like balance became totally irrelevant. It was both awful and wonderful, a kind of chaotic order. I was wrung out. Sun Ra's music is pagan, religious, simple, complex, and almost everything else at the same time. There is no pigeonhole for it. It is ugly and beautiful and terribly interesting. It's new music, yet I've been hearing it for years. Another reviewer agreed, quote, all this band's sound is three-dimensional, a livable world. I mean, you, your ear, your body can move about in it with some freedom. The hypnotic effect is merely an introduction into this freedom of a listening body choosing its way along some rhythm path. Eventually, however, New York police began to crack down on the neighborhood. The Sun Palace was continually cited for noise violations, and when the building came under new ownership, Ra decided to leave the area. The orchestra continued to commute to Slugs on Monday night, even after they moved to Philadelphia in 1968, where saxophonist Marshall Allen's father had a house. From Philadelphia, they went on to worldwide cult fame. But the reputations of the orchestra were made in New York, where Sun Ra had an underground influence on an underground movement. As it turned out, Sun Ra's influence in absentia was much the same on the Chicago underground movement. Okay, this is the conclusion of chapter 3. Jazz-free music is still being performed in lofts and underground spots throughout the world, particularly in New York. The jazz-free revival, its genesis and growth, was distinctly characteristic of the 1960s, however. The enthusiasm for an imminent revolution, the idea that one could change the world, pervaded the minds of diverse artists and activists throughout the era. Similarly, the militant philosophy of hostile black nationalism began to dominate the community of black radicals in the 1960s. Obviously, jazz-free was influenced by both of these currents. The fact is, however, that jazz-free's essence was neither freaking out nor racial conflict. Rather, the veterans of the 1960s jazz-free have continued to dwell upon the conscious but Kabbalistic process of exploring higher spiritual realms through music, freeing the structures of their own minds and the minds of audiences from institutional consensus worldviews. The cultural atmosphere of the 1960s was necessary to give birth to the freedom movement in jazz, but the process of jazz-free required neither the vanguardism nor the black nationalism that were characteristic of the period. To attach jazz-free to either is to miss the essence of the movement. This becomes particularly evident when we examine a similar phenomenon in Chicago, where the ideals of jazz-free were internalized and extended far beyond the 1960s. Okay, that's the end of that chapter, chapter 3. Let's see if we can load up chapter 4 in a reasonable amount of time and start it up. Okay. Oh boy. Okay, chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called The Experimental Band and the Idea of Creative Music. Introduction. In the 1960s, John Coltrane, through his own charisma, communicated his vision of musical transformation to many of his enthusiastic listeners. Sun Ra, Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, and Albert Ayler carried their visions to a smaller audience, including many young musicians. But the movement in Chicago was quite different from the isolated New York subculture in which these artists participated. In Chicago, a dose of South Side ghetto reality was always at hand. A long history of organization helped the musicians realize more quickly that jazz-free was not going to succeed overnight, and that it wouldn't succeed at all without highly organized strategies. As in New York, jazz-free required internal exploration to free the musicians from the influences of institutional hazards by turning to face the creator over the material, by learning to prioritize the creative over the material world. Thereby, the musicians sought to evoke and explore higher states. In Chicago in the 1960s, black musicians used creative organization, presentation, and creative discipline, or petition, to bring about these states. This strategy helped the Chicago musicians sustain the jazz-free ambivalence more than the New York movement, long enough to develop ideas not just for self-defense, but for expansion. Chicago pianist, clarinetist Muhal Richard Abrams, who was born in 1930, was a veteran of Chicago bebop. He had been a member of the MJT+3, one of Chicago's top bebop combos, and he was often called upon to accompany big-name stars from New York when they played Chicago. He played with the greats, but he was also grounded enough to become intimate with the younger members of the local scene who were increasingly on their own in a racially and culturally hostile Chicago. To illustrate, throughout the late 1930s and 40s, the Black Musicians Union attempted to professionalize many of the jobs in the city, which helped many musicians but also restricted impromptu communal music making. With urban renewal project housing, the structure of the house rent party circuit was torn down. In the 1950s, music classes were being phased out of the elementary and secondary schools. In 1961, the cabaret law was passed, meaning that bands had to be comprised of 3 people or fewer, unless the hosting establishment was willing to get a cabaret license, which cost more than $400. Predictably, in the 75 cabarets on the South Side, organ trios became ubiquitous, reflecting the push toward a louder, more electronic sound, which amplified the Chicago blues and made the jazz trio more funky. Abrams saw the difficulties of his own situation, but he also saw the even worse conditions for younger Black musicians, and he began to organize an independent, from New York, jazz-free movement in Chicago. The movement paralleled New York jazz-free in that it tried, through conscientious objection, inversion, and discipline, to activate the creative powers of the higher self to counteract the institutional hazards that were killing the spirit of the music. But Chicago was different in that Abrams's method of orchestration, self-presentation, and self-petition made the Chicago movement more expansive, moving it from individual or small group exploration into a citywide affair. The difference in Chicago was that Abrams gave musicians the opportunity to be leaders of others and of themselves. Abrams believed that the creative musicians could exhibit the unbridled artistic oppositional emotions of improvising Black musicians and at the same time become confident in an institutional context as contributing members and, in fact, as creative leaders of the people. Abrams was quick to realize that the reason it was difficult to play the spontaneous, cathartic music of Ornette Coleman or Cecil Taylor was not a lack of technique, but a lack of confidence in one's own worldview. Abrams was also understood that confidence was an element that could be instilled systematically in the right environment, but that this right environment was becoming a thing of the past on the South Side scene. He therefore attempted to develop a separate space in which young musicians could derive a sustainable way to express the higher states of creativity, a synthesis of discipline and freedom. Okay, that's the end of the introduction. And then section 2 is called The Need for Self-Discipline and Self-Leadership. And I think we're going to start that up tomorrow and call it for today. So thanks for tuning in today. Tomorrow we will start up with section 2 of chapter 4 here. And so stay tuned. And thanks for tuning in. Have a great day.